So this is the context piece of our presentation. We're going to talk about transformation in the 21st century government, but a few notes in the beginning of kind of how we got here. What is the context? What forces came together to create the situation that we're in? And I also think of this part as a little bit of an oversimplified history because I'm going to go through a lot of decades really fast here. But I'm going to start with the late 1800s. And this is a picture of kind of the graft and corruption in local government at that time, the political boss, Tammany Hall, but all that was about to change. In the book, The Responsive City, it says about that time, eager to rid themselves of corruption, incompetence, and unreliability at City Hall, progressive reformers in the late 1800s enshrined rationality, professional standards, and the division of labor. Sound familiar? Government was centralized and organized into separate functional areas. It was securely protected against any abuse of discretion through an orientation towards compliance with regulations, not towards results. So that moment, I think, in our history of local government was transformational, but many decades have gone by since then, and I think many decades of, quote, centralized government into separate functional areas creates what I see today in my mind as looking something a little more like this. So, silos of experts, the mentality that we know best. We have the certifications, we have the degrees, we've paid our dues, moving up the ladder. We're the experts, no reason or incentive to get out of these silos and work cross-departmentally. So after many decades of this, that was put in place for good reason, to get through that period of time in the 1800s, then something major happened with the explosion of the internet in the workplace in the early 1990s. And this, I think, is huge. I don't consider myself to be that old, but I started in my first city before the early 1990s. So in relative speaking, this has not been in place for a huge amount of time. It's still relatively new. When it started, I think those of us that were working at that time were writing kind of poorly written content on websites, in places, putting things in places where nobody could find them and starting online forums and things like that. But then things started moving a lot faster. If you were going through that period of time, you probably felt that. Social media, mobile devices, people wanted to communicate with us through their mobile devices. The app Nextdoor launched in 2012. Does that affect anybody here? Anyone? So that was just 2012. All cities, it's not like cities have been particularly slow to the game. It's not like it took us a long time to catch up. It's all been happening very quickly. The UK digital service, which is considered to be an early model, was just 2012. And the US digital service was just 2014. So there's been an explosion in the change of how people relate to each other and the importance of digital service in government. So that's been happening very recently. This is my image of what I think of when I think of community expectations. Community expectations are very high. I want to hit buy now, and I want the package to show up at my doorstep, and I want to be able to walk out my front door and get what I want very, very quickly. So that's what I think, that's how the community is relating to the commercial, whether they're ordering dinner or whether they're ordering a birthday present. But then they come to us and they encounter more public counters and long lines and things like that, in many cases. But 85% of the public expects the same digital services from government as the private sector, which may be surprising to some of you. People are expecting government to provide the same level of digital service. So they're expecting this, and in many cases, they're still getting this. Another reason, as far as context goes, of why we would need a transformation in local government was the Great Recession. That's a very important thing that happened. Many of us lived through headlines like bankrupt, meltdown, up in arms, financial crisis sparking a wave of popular protest. So all of this is causing us to reduce staffing levels. We don't have the funding anymore to provide the services that we once were able to do. So that's a significant aspect of in our recent history. Some of you that went to the pension presentation saw this chart by coincidence yesterday about looking at the unfunded liabilities and CalPERS funded ratio On the far right-hand side, you see they're at about 71% funded right now. 20 years ago, 128% funded. And then I'll let you try to figure out which of the bar lines is the actuarial liability and which one is the assets. Hint, the really tall one's the liability. The asset is smaller, and look at the gap, you can see it's getting larger over time. So again, what that means to us is service reductions, pressures on salaries, going to the labor table and not being able to meet what your employees are looking for, and that sort of thing. Another big reason is just public trust in government overall. Now, this is the federal government, but these are all of our residents, and the Pew Research Center started tracking this in 1958. And at that point, 3/4 of Americans trusted the federal government to do the right thing almost always or most of the time. And then trust began eroding in the 60s and 70s, Vietnam War, Watergate scandal started to pick up a little bit in the 90s with some economic growth, reached a 3-decade high after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and then declined quickly ever since then. And since 2007, the share of people saying they can trust the government almost or most of the time has not surpassed 30%. So I tend to look at this chart and I just kind of generally see a steady kind of downward trend over time. And that's something that we have to deal with as local government officials. So who do our residents find credible? This is an Endelman Trust Barometer, and on the far right-hand side, you see government officials last on this particular chart. We are slightly less trustworthy than journalists, right there to our left. And really on the other side, you see academic experts, but really people like yourself, regular employees. People are getting their information and they're trusting their colleagues and people like themselves. So this last category is kind of a catch-all of other community factors. I was on a hike with my friend Kip Harkness in San Jose, deputy city manager there, and I was going through all these things, and I'm like, Kip, don't you think it's the public trust and it's the recession, and don't you think it's all of these things, the silos, we still have silos? And Kip said to me, yeah, and then there's massive community growth. And I thought to myself, blind spot. I work in Marin County, we do not have massive community growth there. But there's probably lots of other factors that may be affecting you and your cities of why this is an important topic and why we need to do something about it. So community growth is one of those things. So in summary, why do we need a local transformation in the 21st century? I think we still have this kind of siloization of departments. We have this explosion of the internet, social media, mobile devices. People want to communicate with us differently. They have different time horizons for when they expect to get information back from us and how they want it. Community expectations, more services, they want them to be digital. We're still dealing with the Great Recession, even though it seems like that was a long time ago. I know in my city, we still have to deal with that of not being able to increase staff and resources. All of our unfunded liabilities, which are causing more pressure, increasing costs, service reductions, things like that. And then public trust, I think in general, remaining near historic lows is something that we're all dealing with as well. And then any other sort of local conditions that you have. So not trying to be bleak because we're going to move now into what you do about it or some of the ideas of what you can do about it, but this is a little bit of context, I think, of how do we find ourselves where we're at today? Why are these things important? Why should any of us spend time on this? We've got so many other things we need to be doing. Why should any of us be thinking about transformation and innovation in local government? And I think those are some of the reasons why. I'm going to turn it back over to Matt.